Alright, in this lesson we're going to begin the process of applying some materials to our scene. So at this point, really we have some of our basic light distribution that's been set up and figured out. Now there are still some things to fix up for sure at this point. There are definitely some noise and some other spotty issues that are being caused by the irradiance particles. We also have some pretty bad aliasing issues that need to be taken care of at some point. But the thing is, I really don't want to worry about those at just right this moment, because right now starting to increase those things and starting to remove some of those noise and artifacts is really going to pretty significantly increase our render time. Now at this point, I still want to keep my renders moving as quickly as possible. So it's going to be really tempting for you to come in and try to get everything looking really nice and pretty as early as possible. But really, you want to try to avoid that. Instead, you really want to try to focus on keeping your renders moving as quickly as possible. And then once you get to a point where you pretty much have everything set up and looking satisfactory, then you can start to begin worrying about some of these different quality aspects of it. So just for the interest of keeping our renders moving fast and for the interest of render speed, we're just going to leave these things alone for now. Now what we do want to start to look at is the process of applying some materials and textures to various parts of our room here. So let's go ahead and start with any of these areas. I'll start with something like the floor in this case. So let's go ahead and just clear out some of these different nodes that we had been using in some of our earlier lessons. Now if you recall, I had mentioned that I like to make it a habit of using the architectural materials and other mental ray materials whenever setting up materials for my scenes and things like that. So one that I use very frequently is this architectural material, this MIA Material X. So let's go ahead, drop this in, and we'll call this something like floor material. There we are. So let's go ahead and plug in a texture for this. I actually do have a wood floor texture. So let's come into the diffuse color. Let's plug in a file. And let's go ahead and take a look inside the source images directory. This is found inside our mental images or our mental ray project file. And let's connect in this wood floor. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take this floor, right click, assign to selection. Now for the moment, I'll take this floor material, and it does have reflectivity assigned to it. Let's just go ahead and start to bring this either down to 0, or what we could do is leave its reflectivity set to the default settings. And for now, what we could do is just go into the quality settings. There we go. And in the ray tracing, we can just bring the reflections down to 0. Because at this point, starting to introduce things like reflections is going to start to slow down our scene rendering. And again, just to keep things moving as quickly as possible, what I'll do is just disable my reflections, so that way I can just start to focus on some of the color and some of the light distribution. And then once I get a little bit further along, I can come back, start to worry about the reflections. So let's go ahead and, if we want to, we can save this image from our previous scene and re-render this. Alright, so you can start to see now with this wood floor texture, we can start to get some nice little secondary illumination in here. Although you can see right now this floor texture is way too big. So you can see we have these huge wood patterns in here. So let's go in to this wood texture. Let's go to its Place 2D texture node and start to adjust the repeats until we find something that works for us. So just testing this out, we can try something like maybe 5 and 10. See how that looks. Alright, so that's looking a little bit better. Now in my case, I think I would actually like these different boards to actually run this way along the length of the floor instead of running kind of along the other sets of walls. So let me come in and just rotate this texture so that way the boards are running a little bit more parallel to the front part of this cabinet. So let's come in, go to rotate frame, and let's rotate this 90 degrees. And while we're at it, you'll notice that we can start to see some pretty distinct repeats in this wood pattern. So you can start to see some pretty significant landmarks here that start to repeat themselves. So to just kind of break this up a little bit, I'll turn on this stagger option in my Place 2D texture node for this wood texture. So now let's come in and again re-render this. Okay, so that's now a little bit better as far as the overall texture placement is concerned. Now, one of the things that you may notice as you start to begin working with this is you can see that my texture that I'm using here is very, very washed out. If you compare what we actually have back in my Hypershade, you can see that this wood texture is actually sort of a dark wooden color. But if you compare this to what we actually have in our render, you can see that this is very, very washed out by comparison. Now, what this is coming from is this is actually a result of the photographic exposure node that we had set up in one of our earlier lessons. So if we were to take a look at this MIA exposure photographic, what we have is a situation where this node is actually gamma correcting our image or our final render. So what we want to do is actually start to gamma correct these images in a way that will sort of counteract this gamma correction that's happening on the final render itself. So let's come in and learn how we can do this. This is something that we're going to have to do basically for every single texture in our scene. So this is something that you'll definitely want to start to get familiar with. This is something that you're going to have to use every time you use some kind of a photographic exposure or a simple exposure even. So what we need to do is find a gamma correct, and typically this is found inside the Maya utilities, gamma correct. Now, since this is something that we're going to be using very, very frequently throughout the next several lessons, what I'll probably do is go ahead and take this gamma correct and just very quickly drop this into my favorites, so that way I don't have to continually search for it. So what I can do is just go to my gamma correct, right click on that, and add to favorites. Now it should pop up here in my favorites. There we are. So let's learn how we can use this. What we need to do is take our gamma correct, and for the value, that's where we plug in our texture that we want to use. So middle click, drop our texture into the value, and now for the gamma, what we want to do is put in what is the reciprocal of that gamma correct that we have in our photographic exposure. So if we follow this, again, that gamma is 2.2, which is typically what you would want to use. So that is actually a proper setting. But in order to counteract this gamma in our textures, what we need to do is put in the reciprocal of that 2.2 in this gamma value. Now, roughly, that would be about 0.45. So now what we can do is take that gamma correct and plug that back into our color or our diffuse. So essentially we're just using this gamma correct to just bridge the connection between this texture and the material itself. Now you notice whenever we do that this material comes out very, very dark here in our texture or here in our material itself. Now this is really just kind of where some of the problems come in as far as just kind of eyeballing this. Even though it looks very, very dark here in our material, what we should see is once we actually render this out and that gamma correction of 2.2 from the exposure is applied to that, it should look exactly the way it looks here. Okay? So let's see what this is going to look like now that we have this gamma correction node on this texture. Let's go ahead and save this image for comparison. Re-render. There we are. Excellent. So again, you can see now if you compare what we have in this render to what we actually had in our texture, you can see that this almost matches up perfectly. So again, keep in mind that anytime we're going to use a texture or any kind of a colored swatch, we're going to have to rely very heavily on this gamma correct node. So you will find that we're going to be using this very, very frequently throughout our next several lessons. So continuing along with this process of applying some texture and some other colors to various parts of this kitchen, we'll continue this process in our next lesson.